Picture this, the bustling streets of ancient Rome, circa 67 AD. The sun glints off marble columns, and the chatter of citizens fills the air. Yet something feels eerily off today. As you walk through the crowded forum, a chilling sight catches your eye there. Walking alongside the emperor himself is a beautiful woman. Draped in silks and jewels, she moves with grace, turning heads as Nero strolls proudly beside her. But there's a problem. Whispers fill the air, hushed murmurs shared behind veiled glances. The woman at Nero's side isn't who she seems. This woman, though stunning in appearance, has a past that sends a shudder down the spine of anyone who truly knows the truth. Beneath the silken gown and flowing hair lies a secret too disturbing to ignore. The woman is, in reality, a boy named Sporus. The twisted path that brought Sporus to this place, serving as the emperor's wife, represents one of the most horrifying tales of abuse and psychological manipulation in recorded history. The very notion of seeing a boy dressed as a woman walking beside the emperor was enough to unsettle even the most seasoned Roman citizens. Nero's obsession with recreating his lost love, Poppaea Sabina, was so profound that he had transformed Sporus into a living doll, physically and mentally reshaped to embody the woman he could no longer possess. What could have driven Nero to commit such a horrific act? Was it love, madness, or something far darker? The whispers swirling in the streets of Rome could not even begin to scratch the surface of the twisted story that lay beneath the surface of Nero's reign. What you are about to hear isn't just a tale of royal excess. It is a chilling story of how absolute power can warp love into obsession, grief into madness, and a human being into an object to fulfill one man's twisted fantasy. Let us unravel the mystery of Nero and Sporus, where the line between power and cruelty disappears into a world that seems almost too horrifying to be true. When Nero ascended to the throne of the Roman Empire at just 16 years old, many Romans believed they were witnessing the dawn of a golden age. His early reign, full of youthful promise, showed signs of a ruler who could lead Rome into a prosperous future. At first, Nero seemed like a breath of fresh air. He reduced taxes to lighten the burdens on the common people and funded lavish public games and entertainment that delighted the masses. It seemed for a time that the young emperor might usher in an era of stability and reform. Nero's charismatic personality also helped secure his popularity. He wasn't just a ruler who imposed laws from on high. He also performed in public theaters, delighting the crowds with his theatrical abilities. The very idea of an emperor on stage performing in plays and engaging with the people in such an intimate way was something that had never been seen before. To the average Roman citizen, Nero wasn't just an emperor. He was an entertainer, a man of the people, one who seemed willing to blend the roles of ruler and actor in a way that delighted everyone. But even as Nero's popularity soared, his behavior began to shift. It wasn't long before cracks began to form beneath the polished surface of the young emperor's reign. Absolute power, it seems, has a way of gradually eroding the mind, and for Nero, this transformation was swift and brutal. What seemed like a ruler eager to connect with his people began to morph into a man who could no longer tolerate being contradicted, challenged, or even questioned. Perhaps it was the weight of the throne itself, a symbol of immense power, that started to take its toll. Nero, isolated in his position as the uncontested ruler of an empire of 60 million people, began to develop the paranoia that accompanies absolute authority. His once promising reign began to darken, and the first hints of the madness that would come to define him appeared. Nero's early years on the throne were full of hope. The city of Rome was thriving, and the emperor was admired for his boldness and generosity. Yet, as with many stories of great rulers throughout history, the allure of absolute power began to twist his ambitions. He started to believe he was more than just the ruler of Rome. He was its god. And this belief would set the stage for one of the most tragic and disturbing stories in the annals of Roman history. As the years passed, the image of Nero as a promising youthful ruler gradually unraveled. What began as a reign filled with hope and promise slowly transformed into something far darker as the intoxicating allure of absolute power slowly corrupted him. Nero, once admired for his charm and enthusiasm, became consumed by paranoia and a sense of unchallengeable superiority. The very people who once celebrated him began to fall out of favor in his eyes, and anyone who dared to question or oppose him found themselves in danger. Perhaps it was the unrelenting pressure of ruling the vast Roman Empire that began to erode his mental state. Nero's isolation as emperor was profound. Surrounded by courtiers who could only tell him what he wanted to hear, he grew increasingly distrustful of those closest to him. He feared betrayal at every turn, suspecting that anyone could be a threat to his throne. The paranoia that gripped him turned his mind darker, twisting his once promising reign into a chaotic spiral of erratic behavior. But it was a more personal loss, one of love, that began to unravel the last remnants of Nero's sanity. The woman who would become the most important figure in his life, and whose tragic death would set off a chain of irreversible events, was none other than Poppaea Sabina. Poppaea was a woman who captivated Nero in a way no one else had. She wasn't just beautiful. She was intelligent, ambitious, and bold. She matched Nero's grandiose vision of himself, and he quickly became obsessed with her. Poppaea was everything Nero had longed for in a partner, sharp, self-assured, and unafraid to challenge him. While Nero's first wife, Octavia, was demure and quiet, Poppaea was everything Octavia wasn't: vivacious, commanding, and unapologetically in the spotlight. Their affair began as a scandalous secret, a typical Roman intrigue, but over time it grew into something far more dangerous, an all-consuming obsession. Nero wasn't just attracted to Poppaea. He became obsessed with her, unable to see her as anything other than an object to possess. As his fixation on her deepened, it became clear that Nero's understanding of love had turned into something twisted and unhealthy. Poppaea Sabina was no ordinary woman in the imperial court. She was both a beauty and a force to be reckoned with, someone whose ambition matched Nero's own. When they first met, Nero was already married to Octavia, the daughter of the previous emperor. Their marriage had been cold, political, and lacked any real affection. In contrast, Poppaea was everything Octavia wasn't: radiant, full of life, and unapologetically bold. She reveled in attention, adored being the center of the room, while Octavia preferred to stay in the shadows, away from public scrutiny. It didn't take long for Nero to become captivated by Poppaea. What began as an affair blossomed into a dangerous obsession that would consume him entirely. The Emperor, once full of potential and charm, now found his every waking moment dedicated to thoughts of Poppaea. She was a woman whose beauty and intellect both stunned him and threatened him in equal measure. She made him feel powerful, but also exposed his weaknesses, for she was never afraid to challenge him. This was a woman who would argue with him about policy, mock his performances, and challenge his ideas, actions that sent shockwaves through the imperial court. Poppaea was the first woman to make Nero feel vulnerable, and the first to make him realize that he might not be as invincible as he had once believed. She had the courage to speak her mind and refuse to play the role of a passive, docile wife. She wasn't merely content to be by Nero's side. She wanted to shape the empire with him. Nero was captivated, but he also felt threatened. Poppaea had a sharp mind, and unlike most people around him, she wasn't afraid to push back. She wasn't afraid to use her power and beauty to secure her position, even if it meant making enemies along the way. She built a network of supporters, ensuring that if Nero's affections ever wavered, she would have allies to protect her. Her intelligence and ambition made her a formidable force, and Nero's growing obsession with her turned from admiration into something much darker, something that threatened to consume both of them. It was her very strength, her refusal to be subjugated, that ultimately sealed her fate. She became more than just a lover to Nero. She became an obsession. Her beauty, her power, her independence, all of it was now part of a dangerous equation that was unraveling rapidly. Nero's obsession with Poppaea Sabina transcended simple desire. It became an all-consuming fixation that started to dominate his every thought and action. As the Emperor became more enraptured by Poppaea, his behavior grew increasingly erratic, reflecting the dangerous trajectory of his mind. He wasn't just in love with her. He believed that he owned her, and his overwhelming need to control her grew more intense with each passing day. Poppaea had never been a passive figure. She was strong-willed, outspoken, and confident, traits that were rare and often dangerous for women in the rigid political landscape of ancient Rome. But it was these very traits that also made her so appealing to Nero. To him, she represented everything he desired: beauty, intelligence, and ambition. Yet, as his obsession deepened, it became clear that Nero was no longer seeing her as a partner or equal, but as a possession, something to be controlled and kept from the rest of the world. The Emperor surrounded Poppaea with an ever-growing circle of guards, ostensibly for her protection, but the real purpose was to monitor her every move, to ensure that she was kept entirely under his watch. He grew paranoid at the mere thought of another man speaking to her, fearing that any glance from a stranger might steal her affection. He lavished her with expensive gifts, exotic jewels, silks, and perfumes from distant lands, each one an attempt to purchase her loyalty, as if material wealth could ever compensate for the growing imbalance of power in their relationship. But it wasn't just gifts that Nero offered. He reshaped reality itself to accommodate his obsessive desires. He transformed his imperial household to center around her, isolating her from her family, her friends, and any influence that could challenge his control. To Nero, this was a manifestation of his love. But to anyone watching from the outside, it was becoming clear that it was far from healthy. Poppia was no longer a woman in her own right. She had become an object, a prize for Nero to show off and manipulate. Ancient historians note that Nero was so possessive that he commissioned countless portraits and sculptures of Poppia, not just for public display, but for his private chambers, so he could gaze upon her likeness whenever they were apart. It was almost as if he needed to be surrounded by her image to reassure himself that she was his. But the unsettling truth lay in the fact that this wasn't devotion. It was an attempt to imprison Poppia within a frame, both literally and figuratively, and erase her independence altogether. It wasn't just about controlling her appearances or her relationships, it was about erasing her agency. Nero began to change the way the world saw Poppia. She had to fit into his image of her, and if she didn't, he would stop at nothing to force her into compliance. The emotional and psychological toll on Poppia must have been immense, for she was living in a gilded cage, adored, but entirely subjugated by the whims of the Emperor. This was a woman who had once been the embodiment of strength and independence, but now she was being slowly suffocated by the overwhelming force of Nero's obsession. The simmering tension between Nero and Poppia Sabina, which had been escalating for months, reached a tragic boiling point in 65 AD. Their relationship had already become a toxic web of possessiveness, control, and manipulation. Poppia, who had once enjoyed power and influence, was now a mere shadow of her former self, isolated, controlled, and under constant scrutiny. Yet despite the gilded cage Nero had trapped her in, Poppia still managed to retain a degree of independence, something that would ultimately cost her dearly. The fateful day began like many others, a public event, a conversation in the imperial palace, an argument that would quickly spiral out of control. The details of their dispute remain somewhat murky, as ancient historians have different accounts of what exactly set Nero off. Some suggest it was a quarrel over Nero's late return from a chariot race. Others say it was about his obsessive focus on his theatrical pursuits, a passion that Poppia had often mocked. What we do know is that whatever the trigger, Nero's rage quickly escalated beyond reason. At some point during the argument, Poppia, perhaps worn down by the constant emotional strain of living under Nero's thumb, made a daring and dangerous remark. She criticized Nero for prioritizing his public image over his responsibilities as a husband. In that moment, she dared to speak truth to power, and it was a fatal misstep. For Nero, whose ego had grown to monstrous proportions, this criticism was unforgivable. His response was swift and violent. According to the ancient historian Tacitus, Nero, in a fit of rage, either kicked or struck his pregnant wife with such brutal force that she suffered fatal internal injuries. Some sources suggest a single violent blow to her abdomen. Others describe a more sustained assault. What is certain, however, is that the act was horrific. Poppia collapsed bleeding and unconscious onto the cold marble floor of the palace. Imagine the scene: Nero, the most powerful man in the world, suddenly realizing the devastating weight of his actions. The woman he had adored, obsessed over, and ultimately tried to control, had just died at his hands. The grief and guilt he must have felt in that moment were undoubtedly profound, but more so was the shock and disbelief that a simple argument, an outburst of anger, had led to the death of the one person who had meant more to him than anyone else. Nero's reaction was far from composed. Ancient sources describe a scene of utter desperation. He threw himself on Poppia's lifeless body, alternately begging her forgiveness and demanding her to live, as if his imperial authority could command even death itself. In a panic, he summoned the best physicians in Rome, offering them enormous sums of money in exchange for their services, but to no avail. Poppia was already gone, and with her death, Nero's sanity began to unravel completely. For Nero, this wasn't just the loss of a wife. It was the loss of an obsession, the one person who had been his anchor, even as his obsessive need for control over her had driven him to madness. His grief became legendary, not for its depth or authenticity, but for its sheer delusional quality. Nero insisted that Poppia's body be embalmed rather than cremated, a break from Roman custom, and placed in a tomb more elaborate than those of previous emperors. He even declared her divine, establishing a cult in her honor. For days after her death, Nero wandered the palace, speaking to her corpse as if she were still alive, his words falling on deaf ears. The emotional devastation was so profound that it seemed to break something inside him, triggering a complete collapse into madness. He could no longer see the world as it truly was. Poppia, the woman he had destroyed, became more real to him in death than she had ever been in life. Meanwhile, the imperial court was forced to play along with this macabre fantasy. Courtiers were expected to speak of Poppia in the present tense, as though she were still alive, and her favorite seat at banquets was left empty, as if she were simply absent, not gone forever. Anyone who dared suggest that Nero should move on from his grief-faced exile, or worse, it was during this period of irrational mourning that Sporus, a young man from the imperial household, would enter Nero's life and fatefully his cruel obsession. Sporus, with his striking resemblance to the late Poppia, would soon become the living embodiment of Nero's twisted grief and madness. Amidst Nero's grief and delusion, a boy named Sporus entered the imperial scene, unknowingly stepping into a nightmare that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Sporus was not a nobleman or someone with significant standing in Roman society. He was a young man born into slavery within the imperial household. Raised within the palace walls, he had received an education that prepared him for administrative duties, which for a freedman was a relatively privileged position. He had a degree of comfort, but with that comfort came absolute dependency on Nero's favor, meaning that his life and future were entirely at the emperor's mercy. What made Sporus stand out, however, wasn't his intelligence or his skills, it was his appearance. The young man bore an uncanny resemblance to Poppia Sabina, especially around the eyes and the delicate bone structure of his face. In ancient Rome, the belief in similitudo, or the idea that physical resemblance to another person signified a deeper spiritual connection, was widespread. To Nero, this physical similarity appeared almost supernatural, a sign that the spirit of his beloved Poppia had somehow returned to him in another form. When Nero first saw Sporus after Poppia's death, it is said that something clicked in his fractured mind. For a brief delusional moment, Nero may have believed he was seeing the spirit of Poppia herself. Here, in the form of this young boy, was the chance to undo the irreversible tragedy that had haunted him since the day he had killed her. But of course, there was one glaring problem: Sporus was male. But Nero, who had already convinced himself that he was above all human limitations, a god among men, saw no obstacle in changing Sporus's gender to recreate his lost wife. What followed next was one of the most horrifying acts of cruelty ever inflicted upon another human being. Nero's broken mind did not see Sporus as a person, but rather as an object that could be transformed into the living embodiment of Poppia. In his deluded state, Nero could not fathom the idea of a world without Poppia by his side. To restore what he had lost, he would force Sporus into a grotesque, irreversible transformation. The emperor summoned the finest physicians in Rome, not to treat Sporus for an illness or injury, but to perform a brutal and dangerous operation, castration. This was not a matter of medical necessity or personal choice. It was Nero's twisted attempt to bend Sporus to his will, to erase the boy's identity, and force him into the mold of the dead empress. Sporus, who had no choice in the matter, was held down while the physicians carried out the cruel procedure, which was extremely dangerous by ancient standards. The operation performed in the imperial palace would have been agonizing and traumatic, lasting hours under primitive conditions, with no modern anesthetics to ease the pain. It was a procedure that could, and often did, result in infection or death from blood loss. But in Nero's mind, this was a small price to pay for the restoration of his beloved Poppia. The psychological toll of this operation on Sporus was unfathomable. Not only was he physically mutilated, but his very identity was obliterated in a way that left him no escape. No longer a man, he was now to live as a woman, Nero's reincarnated Poppia. He would never again experience the life he might have had, never again be seen as a whole person in his own right. Instead, he would be forced to play a role that had been thrust upon him, a performance that required him to not only look like Poppia, but to be Poppia, to embody her completely. But the transformation didn't end with physical mutilation. Nero, in his madness, was determined that Sporus should be molded into every aspect of the woman he had once adored. Sporus was given a new name, Sabina, after Poppia. He was moved into special quarters and trained for his new life as Nero's wife. This was no ordinary life. This was a life of constant performance, where every gesture, every word, and every action had to reflect the woman Nero believed he had brought back to life. The transformation wasn't just physical. It was psychological, emotional, and social. Sporus had to learn how to walk, sit, and gesture like a woman. He had tutors to teach him how to speak in a higher tone, how to wear his hair, how to apply makeup, all designed to erase every trace of the boy he had once been. These lessons were not just superficial. They were an assault on his very identity, forcing him to lose himself in the performance of a role he never chose. The process of feminizing Sporus was relentless, and the psychological strain must have been unbearable. His appearance, once his own, was now altered beyond recognition. Each day he would face a mirror that no longer reflected his true self. Each day he would have to perform as Poppia, responding to Nero's delusional demands, with precision embodying the woman who had once captured his captor's heart. Once Sporus had endured the physical transformation, Nero was ready to announce to the world what he believed to be the return of his beloved Poppia, now embodied in the form of Sporus. The emperor, who had already become infamous for his erratic behavior and excesses, spared no expense in turning Sporus into his empress. In his delusion, Nero believed that this new incarnation of Poppia would fill the emptiness left by her death, restoring his world to some semblance of normalcy. The wedding ceremony held in the spring of 67 AD was a spectacle of imperial excess. It was set during the religious festivals, ensuring that the ceremony would have the added weight of sacred importance. Nero wanted the world to know that this wasn't just a marriage, it was a grand, imperial affair, a restoration of order in his shattered mind. The ceremony was held in one of the largest palace halls in Rome, illuminated by thousands of oil lamps and filled with the rich scents of imported flowers. Musicians played traditional wedding songs, while servants offered the finest wines and delicacies to guests. On the surface, it seemed like any other royal wedding, lavish, full of pomp and ceremony. But behind the curtains of grandeur, the truth was far more sinister. Those who were in the know understood that this was no ordinary marriage. Nero wasn't marrying a woman, he was marrying a young boy who had been surgically altered to resemble his dead wife. It was an unprecedented and disturbing spectacle, a public performance of Nero's twisted grief and obsession. For the aristocrats who attended the event, must have been a strange and eerie blend of luxury and horror, where the emperor's delusion was presented as reality, and anyone who dared question it risked losing everything. During the ceremony, Sporus was dressed in the finest imperial gowns created specifically to flatter his new modified form. His hair was styled meticulously, his face painted with cosmetics to enhance his feminine features. He wore jewels that had once belonged to Poppia herself, tangible relics of the woman he was forced to replace. In this moment, he became not Sporus, the young boy he once was, but the image of Poppia, an object for Nero's mourning and madness. The imperial wedding rituals followed exchanging vows, joining hands, sharing sacred bread, and signing legal documents to make the union official. But there was no joy in this union, no real bond between the two participants. It was a grotesque performance, one that required Sporus to act as Poppia in every possible way. For Nero, this wasn't a marriage. It was the continuation of his obsessive control, his desperate need to possess the memory of the woman he had loved and killed. While the wedding might have been perceived as a joyful occasion by the outside world, it was a horrifying facade. Sporus, now an unwilling wife to Nero, was condemned to a life of psychological torment, forced to maintain the elaborate fiction that he was Poppia. His every move, every glance, every word had to reflect the woman Nero had lost, not who Sporus was, not who he had been, but who Nero desperately needed him to be. After the wedding, Sporus's life became an ongoing tragic performance. The role that Nero had thrust upon him was not one he could escape. Every day he was expected to embody the image of Poppia Sabina, both publicly and privately. This was not just a matter of wearing a dress and looking the part. It was a relentless psychological and emotional ordeal. Sporus, who had once been a young boy with his own identity, was now trapped in a living nightmare. As Nero's wife, Sporus, was required to accompany the emperor to public functions, sit by his side at state dinners, and attend lavish events. Everywhere they went, Sporus was paraded before the world expected to maintain the appearance of a woman who had once held a powerful position in the Roman Empire. He had to respond to Nero's reminiscences about Poppaea, as though they were his own memories, pretending to be the woman Nero had once loved so obsessively. This constant act, pretending to be someone else, must have been psychologically devastating. Imagine waking up each day to see a stranger's face in the mirror, the reflection of a person you no longer recognized. Sporus was forced to suppress every trace of his original self and perform the role of Poppaea, fulfilling a fantasy crafted by Nero's delusions. The physical alterations to his body, permanent and painful, were just the beginning. The real torture lay in the loss of his agency, his identity, and his very sense of self. Nero's need to control Sporus went beyond the superficial. He was obsessed with making sure that Sporus never broke character, that he always acted the part of Poppaea, both in public and private. Nero would call him by the name of his dead wife, and expect him to respond as if the woman she once was still alive. Every day was an exercise in fear of making a mistake, of breaking the illusion of disappointing Nero. Any slip-up could result in punishment, exile, or worse. The psychological pressure on Sporus was unimaginable. Every conversation, every glance, every gesture had to be perfect, had to match Nero's deluded expectations. And yet, despite the extreme trauma, Sporus continued to play the part. Over time, he became almost too good at it. Ancient sources note that he developed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate Nero's moods, responding in ways that would keep him safe from his emperor's unpredictable temper. But underneath the mask, Sporus was withdrawing. While he continued to perform the role of Poppaea with increasing skill, the emotional toll of living as someone else, of being trapped in an identity that was not his own, was slowly eroding him. His mental state must have been fragile, and the strain of maintaining the facade must have been unbearable. The once vibrant young man had been reduced to a mere puppet controlled by Nero's whims. Nero's empire was crumbling, and with it the fragile stability of Sporus's existence. As the emperor's grip on power weakened, the absurdity of his relationship with Sporus began to show even more clearly to those around him. Yet, for Sporus, there was no escape. He had been transformed into the living embodiment of a ghost Nero's obsession made flesh. His life was now defined by the tragedy of a love twisted beyond recognition, and the unrelenting cruelty of the emperor who had redefined him in his own image. As if the suffering Sporus endured in private wasn't enough, Nero decided to further parade him before the world. The emperor, increasingly consumed by his delusions, sought to showcase his creation, his Poppaea reborn, to a wider audience. Nero had long fancied himself an artist, a performer, and he yearned for the admiration of the Greek aristocrats who were considered the pinnacle of cultural refinement. In 67 AD, Nero embarked on a grand tour of Greece to compete in their famed festivals, particularly in artistic events that celebrated Greek drama and music. Naturally, Sporus, as Nero's wife, was brought along to accompany him on this journey. This was more than a public event. It was a grotesque spectacle, one that would showcase the depth of Nero's obsession and the absolute erasure of Sporus's true identity. Sporus, now a living reminder of Nero's twisted grief, was paraded through foreign lands, dressed as a woman forced to perform as a stand-in for the late Poppia. Imagine the scene Greek aristocrats raised in a culture of refined aesthetics, witnessing a teenage boy, now surgically altered to look like a woman, being presented as the Empress of Rome. It must have been both perplexing and horrifying for them as they tried to make sense of the bizarre spectacle unfolding before their eyes. But for Sporus, this was the ultimate public degradation. He was no longer seen as an individual with hopes and dreams, but as an object for Nero's self-gratifying delusion, a role that demanded constant performance. Every smile, every glance, every word had to be delivered, as Poppia no longer Sporus. The psychological strain of such a life of playing the role of a woman who had once been loved and then violently replaced was almost unimaginable. The Greek aristocrats, no strangers to theater and performance, could likely see the grotesque nature of this scene. To them, it was a macabre display, Nero, the Emperor of Rome, reduced to a desperate man, clinging to his dead wife's memory. But for Sporus, this public humiliation was just another stage of his torment, one that had no ending. Every public appearance, every gathering became a prison of his own making, where the slightest misstep could result in Nero's wrath. For the people around them, this spectacle served as a reminder of Nero's erratic behavior and his increasingly disconnected grip on reality. Yet for Sporus, it was a personal hell. His life had been stripped of any semblance of normalcy. He was a living symbol of the Emperor's twisted desires, a pawn in the most tragic and disturbing game of power imaginable. By 68 AD, Nero's reign had begun to unravel at a rapid pace. The grandeur of his early years, marked by public displays of lavishness and excess, had given way to increasingly erratic and destructive behavior. His paranoia, compounded by his unyielding need for control, led him to alienate those closest to him. His once strong alliances faltered, and the empire, weary of his madness, began to rise against him. Rebellions broke out across Rome, with governors and military leaders turning against their emperor. Even the Praetorian Guard, the elite force tasked with protecting him, began to question his rule. For Nero, the end was inevitable. His reign had long been one of excess extravagance in entertainment, obsession in personal relationships, and cruelty in governance. But now the empire was fed up. The Senate declared Nero an enemy of the state, and the political system that had once bowed to his every whim turned on him. Faced with mounting opposition, Nero had no choice but to flee Rome. He retreated to a villa outside the city with a small group of loyalists, hoping to avoid capture. But it was clear that his time as emperor had come to an end. In his final days, Nero was torn between the grandiose fantasies of escape and the harsh reality of defeat. He hatched numerous plans to reclaim his throne, all while preparing for the ultimate act of theatricality, suicide. As Nero's enemies closed in, the emperor, who had once been hailed as the most powerful man in the world, chose death rather than face humiliation. On June 9th, 68 AD, Nero took his own life, ending his reign in the most tragic and ironic way possible, by committing the very act he had forced others to perform in his empire. But what of Sporus, the boy whose life had been molded by Nero's delusions? As the Emperor's reign collapsed, Sporus, now a living symbol of Nero's madness, became both a liability and a prize. With Nero's death, the puppet master was gone, but Sporus's fate remained uncertain. No longer an empress, but still trapped in the role that Nero had forced upon him, Sporus was left vulnerable to the shifting tides of Roman politics. Now he was a political pawn, passed from one powerful man to another, like a piece of property, his fate dictated by those who saw him as a living reminder of the former emperor's cruelty. The downfall of Nero didn't mean the end of Sporus's torment. Instead, he was handed over to new rulers, each using him as they saw fit. First claimed by Nigadus Sabinus, then by Otho, and finally by Vitellius Sporus, was dressed as a woman and continued to play the role of Nero's wife, a living relic of imperial decadence. To each new ruler, Sporus was no longer a person, but a spectacle, a pawn to be used for their own amusement and power. In the political chaos that followed Nero's death, Sporus remained trapped in his role, no longer a victim of a single man's obsession, but a symbol of the horrors of absolute power. The next emperor, Vitellius, would make Sporus a public spectacle in the most degrading way possible. The tragic story of Sporus took a final humiliating turn under the rule of the new Emperor Vitellius. With Nero gone, the once absolute power he had wielded was now fragmented, and Sporus, no longer protected by the whims of a mad emperor, was at the mercy of those who followed. In the chaotic aftermath of Nero's death, Sporus became a pawn in the hands of those who saw him not as a human being, but as a symbol of imperial decadence, a grotesque reminder of the excesses of the past. Vitellius, who had seized the throne in the wake of Nero's downfall, saw Sporus as both a trophy and a spectacle to display. With his appearance now forever altered by Nero's cruel transformation, Sporus was paraded for the amusement of the new emperor's court. But the real degradation came when Sporus was forced into public entertainment in the Roman Colosseum, a fate that would mark the ultimate culmination of his suffering. In one of the most horrific public performances, Sporus was made to participate in a reenactment of mythological scenes, many involving violence and humiliation. The Colosseum, a place where gladiators fought to the death for the entertainment of the masses, became the stage for Sporus's final degradation. The public who had once admired the spectacle of the Roman Empire were now forced to witness the tragic and grotesque reality of imperial excess. Sporus was made to perform for the enjoyment of those who saw his humiliation as part of the show, a grotesque reminder of the power that emperors could wield over the lives of their subjects. To be paraded before the masses in such a manner was the ultimate insult, a life stripped of all dignity, reduced to nothing more than a source of entertainment for the cruel amusement of the Roman elite. Sporus was not just a man. He had become a puppet, forced to play a role he never chose, and the public's laughter became the final crushing blow to his humanity. This public humiliation, designed to break Sporus completely, was the culmination of a life already marred by psychological and physical torment. His transformation had been brutal, his forced role as Nero's wife devastating, and now, under Vitellius, he was reduced to nothing more than an object of amusement. The cruelty he endured was incomprehensible, and the emotional toll of these public displays was unimaginable. But Sporus had reached his breaking point, his life marked by one horrifying event after another, had left him with nothing. The final humiliation in the Colosseum was more than he could bear. Rather than submit to this ultimate degradation, Sporus made a choice that would finally give him control over his fate, a last act of defiance after years of suffering. After everything Sporus had endured, his transformation into a woman, his forced role as Nero's living wife, the constant humiliation, and the public performances, he reached the end of his rope. His identity had been stripped from him, his humanity reduced to a puppet for the whims of the Emperor, and now under Vitellius, he was being paraded around like a circus act for the amusement of the masses. The final public spectacle in the Colosseum, where he was humiliated before thousands, was the breaking point. For a young man who had once been free, whose future had been erased by the violent, perverse actions of one emperor, the unbearable weight of his life finally pushed him to a desperate choice: death. In 69 AD, Sporus took his own life, probably by poison, just around the age of 20. This tragic end marked the final chapter in a life that had been completely consumed by the cruelty of the Roman Empire and its rulers. In his death, Sporus reclaimed the one thing that had been denied him throughout his tortured existence: the power to make his own choice. His suicide was not a mere act of despair, but also a final act of defiance. After years of enduring the unthinkable, of being forced to live as someone he was not, Sporus chose to end the twisted theater of his life, rather than continue to suffer as a mere object in Nero's delusion and Vitellius's cruel display. His death symbolized the utter loss of a life that could have been, but also a rejection of the dehumanization he had been subjected to. Sporus's story is one of the darkest and most tragic of ancient Rome, a tale not just of imperial excess, but of a human life obliterated by the unchecked cruelty of absolute power. His life and death serve as a powerful reminder of the devastating consequences of treating others as objects for power control and amusement. What makes Sporus's story so haunting is not only the abuse he endured, but the complete erasure of his identity and humanity. From the moment Nero decided that Sporus resembled his dead wife Poppaea, the young boy ceased to exist as an individual. Instead, he became a canvas on which the Emperor projected his delusions, a living doll to serve his twisted fantasies. Sporus was forced to live a lie, and in the end, he chose death as the only escape from the nightmare he had been thrust into. His story, a tragic testament to both human cruelty and resilience, is often overlooked in the annals of history, but it deserves to be remembered not as a curiosity of imperial decadence, but as a powerful reminder of the profound cost of power and the human spirit's ability to resist even in the face of unspeakable torment. The story of Sporus is one of the most tragic and disturbing narratives from ancient Rome, yet it is often overshadowed by the more familiar tales of emperors, gladiators, and military conquests. Sporus's life, however, is a stark reminder of the human cost of unchecked power and the devastating consequences of imperial excess. In the grand historical narrative of Rome's rise and fall, Sporus is but a footnote, a victim lost in the shadows of imperial grandeur. but his life shaped by cruelty and manipulated for the entertainment of the powerful speaks volumes about the fragility of human dignity in the face of absolute control. His story is a cautionary tale, not just about the dangers of tyranny, but about the psychological and emotional devastation that can be inflicted upon an individual who is reduced to a mere object of power and desire. What makes Sporus's story so chilling is not just the brutality he suffered, but the fact that he was never seen as a person by those who controlled his fate. From Nero to Vitellius, he was treated as a tool to fulfill someone else's desires, a living, breathing object that could be manipulated, molded, and destroyed. The emotional and psychological impact of such treatment was profound, and it is clear that even in his final moments, Sporus had not been allowed to live as himself. His death, the final act of defiance, was the only thing left to him. In choosing to end his life rather than endure further humiliation, Sporus reclaimed the one thing that had been denied to him, the agency to make a choice. His suicide was not a surrender, but an assertion of his autonomy, a refusal to remain a pawn in the twisted game of imperial excess. But Sporus's legacy is not just about the suffering he endured. It also serves as a reminder of the dangers of power, absolute power, that can warp human relationships, strip away empathy, and turn individuals into mere instruments of the ruler's whims. Nero, once a promising emperor, was consumed by his obsession with Poppaea, and in doing so he destroyed not only her life, but also the life of a young boy who had no part in his delusion. Sporus's story should be remembered not just as a tragic event in Roman history, but as a powerful symbol of human resilience. Despite the psychological and physical mutilation, despite the overwhelming odds, Sporus fought in his own way to maintain some semblance of dignity, even if it meant the ultimate sacrifice. In the end, the life of Sporus, both in its tragic beginnings and its horrific end, reminds us that beneath every grand historical narrative, behind every story of imperial conquest, there are human lives that are shaped broken and sometimes obliterated by the forces of unchecked power. Sporus's story is one that calls us to reflect on the ways in which we view and treat others, particularly those who have little to no power, and to understand that even the most powerful empires have a human cost. His story deserves to be remembered, not just as a curiosity from the past, but as a testament to the enduring human spirit and the importance of compassion, respect, and dignity for all. As we look back at the grandeur of the Roman Empire and the extraordinary lives of its rulers, it is easy to become captivated by the power, wealth, and spectacle. Yet behind these larger-than-life figures and the splendor of imperial Rome lies the often forgotten human cost stories, like that of Sporus, whose life and death were shaped entirely by the whims of emperors. His story forces us to confront the dark realities that lurked behind the glory of one of the greatest empires in history. Sporus was not born into the history books. He did not choose to become a symbol of imperial cruelty or a pawn in the games of power. But by virtue of his appearance and the actions of one of the most unhinged emperors in Roman history, his name became linked with a tragedy that speaks to the heart of human suffering. Sporus's life was erased not just by physical mutilation, but by the loss of agency, identity, and humanity, an irreversible transformation that served only to satisfy Nero's grief-stricken delusions. We know little about Sporus before his transformation into Nero's living doll, but the few details we have, his youth, his background as a freed slave in the imperial household, suggest that he was at one point an individual with his own potential, his own dreams. His story is one of stolen identity, forced submission, and ultimate degradation. He was never given the chance to live for himself, to forge his own path, or make his own choices. His existence was shaped by others, first Nero, who molded him into a grotesque replica of his dead wife, and then by the political powers who treated him as a trophy and a spectacle. But there is something hauntingly human in the way Sporus managed to retain a sliver of dignity in his final act. His decision to end his life, rather than continue as a pawn in someone else's twisted game, was in many ways the only choice left to him. It was a refusal to be further dehumanized, an assertion of autonomy, even in the face of complete devastation. In his death, Sporus reclaimed the one thing that had been stripped away from him, the right to make his own decision about his fate. In remembering Sporus, we are not just recalling a forgotten tragedy from ancient Rome. We are acknowledging the reality of power's ability to strip away humanity. His story is a stark reminder that beneath the grand narratives of empires, there are always individual lives, lives that can be broken, crushed, and forgotten by the forces of unchecked power. Sporus's legacy, though tragic, serves as a poignant warning against the dangers of absolute control, the consequences of seeing people not as individuals, but as objects to be manipulated for personal gain. Perhaps it is time to reconsider how we view history, not just as a collection of grand victories and monumental figures, but also as the story of the countless individuals who lived and died under those who held power. Sporus, like so many others, remains a symbol of both the cruelty of the powerful and the resilience of the human spirit. His life, though tragically short and marred by unimaginable suffering, speaks to the larger truth of human dignity, the one thing that cannot be entirely destroyed, even in the most oppressive of circumstances. Sporus may have died a victim of imperial excess, but his story continues to echo down the centuries. In remembering him, we acknowledge the complex and painful truth that behind every story of empire, behind every great figure of history, there are human stories of suffering, survival, and the cost of power. Sporus's legacy may not be found in the glory of Rome, but in the quiet lessons his life imparts about humanity, cruelty, and resilience.